Hi guys, today we're going to be looking at chapter 3 of the Ecce Romani textbook titled In the Garden. And in this chapter you're going to be introduced to the two young boys of our Roman family named Marcus and Sextus. And you're going to read about this prank that they pull on one of the family slaves whose name is Davus. In this chapter the grammar you're going to learn is how to switch Latin nouns and adjectives from their singular to their plural forms. So again, to start, we really want to look at the vocabulary because that's the key to understanding what's going on in each of these stories. So let's start with the word puer, which means boy. From this, you get the words puerile and puerility in English, and both of them have to do with acting childish or acting as a young boy in this case. The next phrase is in horto. And specifically, we want to look at the horto part of that, which is where you get horticulture and horticulturalist in English. Now, the word horto is a garden. It comes from hortus. And what horticulture is, it's basically the scientific word for gardening, growing plants type idea. And a horticulturalist is a person who does gardening. That's the fancy word for them. The next word is clamant, which means they shout. And this is where we get the words claim and exclaim in English. And if you think specifically of exclaim, which in Latin would literally mean to shout out, that's what it means in English. You know, you're shouting something, exclaiming it. That will help you remember this word. Redent gives us the words ridicule, ridiculous, deride is another one, and even derisive. And these all have to do with an idea of laughing. So redent in Latin means they laugh. And if you're ridiculing someone, you're basically making fun of them or laughing at them. Same with the word ridiculous. It's something that you're describing as being laughable. You know, it's something so crazy you're laughing at it, or I guess making fun of it too. The next word, vir, means man, and it's where we get words like virtue, triumvirate, and virile. So when you have the word like virtue, for instance, it originally meant behaving properly or behaving, as any good man should. And it's got the word for man right inside of it. Same with the word triumvirate. When you study Roman history, you're going to see Julius Caesar was part of a triumvirate. And it's got the word tri in it, which means three, and vir, meaning man. So this triumvirate is the rule of three men, is the idea. Servus is a word for slave in Latin, and it gives us words like serf, servant, servile, service, and even servitude. And they all have to do with, doing something for someone else, basically acting like a slave. A serf, when you study medieval history, is the peasant class, who's out working the fields. They are the slaves. And it's the same with the word servitude in English, which is another word for slavery. All five of these words have to do with either slavery or being a slave. Multi is a word in Latin that means many. And it's where we get in English words like multitude, multiply, multiple, and even the root multi we attach to words like multimillionaire, which means you have many millions, right? All of these words have to do with having, many of something. So the multitude is when you're talking about, say, a crowd. It's a very big crowd of many people. When you're multiplying a number, you're making it many times bigger. That's where these words come from, this root of multi. Laborant means they work in Latin, and this is where we get the words like labor, laboratory, and belabor in English. So they all have to do with working in one sense or another. Labor in English stands for itself. It keeps the exact same meaning. You might not have thought of a laboratory in this sense, but even in science class, it's where you're doing work. You work in a laboratory, and it keeps that word labor right in the beginning. The next word is solus, which means alone in English. And this is where we get the words like soul, solitary, soliloquy, desolate, and even solo in English. And they all have to do with being either by yourself or being alone. Soul keeps basically the exact same meaning in English. If you've ever studied Shakespeare, which I'm sure you will at some point, you'll see the word soliloquy, which is literally in Latin means talking to yourself. It has both roots in it. And again, words like solo, solitary, they all have to do with being by yourself. Iratus is a word where we get in English irate from. It has to do with anger, and we're going to see that there's another word ira in Latin, which means anger, but this is the same root. If someone is described as iratus, they're very angry. And just think of the word irate, and you'll get the meaning. The next phrase, in piscinam, gives us this root of piscis in Latin, which means fish. And a piscinam is a fish pond. And you'll see that it holds this meaning in a couple other languages. So for instance, if you're looking at Spanish, French, or Italian, you'll see these words like piscine or piscina. They're all holding that same meaning. Originally, they're coming from this idea of a pond or a fish pond, but they translate into a large pool of water or a swimming pool in other Romance languages. And again, if you're ever thinking of why it's spelled this way, it's got the word for fish right in it, because originally it would have been a fish pond. Cadit is a verb that gives us the word cadence, case, cascade, decay. They all come from this word in English. Also, accident is another one, and even decadence. They all have to do with the word cadit, which means he falls. And if you think about these words, they all have to do with falling one way or another. So the cadence of someone's voice is that falling pitch at the end of a sentence. That's what we call the cadence. And a cascade is a giant wave of falling water, or maybe even a waterfall. You could think of it that way. The word decay in English refers to something that's falling into a state of ruin, such as an abandoned building or a lost civilization. So that's where the falling comes into account. And decadence is a process of falling into an inferior condition. So in other words, if your civilization is showing moral decadence, it's talking about this state of you're going to fall into decay and your civilization will fall apart, basically. For this chapter's grammar, we're going to be looking at nouns and adjectives, and specifically we're going back to the singular forms that we already know and trying to figure out how we make them plural. Mastering this will allow us to create more complex sentences and translate more complex sentences in our book that involve more than one person. So let's just take a look. So if we think of singular and plural in English, we know how to make words that are singular, such as boy or car, into plurals. So for instance, for boy, we just add the S and we get boys. And the same thing for car. Car turns into cars. All we're doing is adding an S in English. That's one of the basic markers for making a plural in English. In Latin, it's slightly different. We do something similar though, in that we change the ending of the word, and that shows us whether or not the word is singular or plural. So if we think about the three endings we've seen so far in our book, we've seen the letter a US, and an R at the end of words. And there's a particular reason why we've seen these, but we'll get to that in later chapters. But for right now, the basic rule is that whenever you see an A, to make it go from singular to plural, we're switching it to an AE, which we're going to see in this chapter. With US, we're switching it to a long I, and for R, we're also switching it to a long I. And we're going to see exactly how this works in the next couple of slides and in this chapter. So if we think of the words puella, servus, or puer, how do we change these from singular to plural? So with puella, which is the word for girl, how do we make it girls? Well, think of our rule. The A turns into an AE. You get puellae, which means girls. With servus, it ends in a US, so we switch it to a long I. Servus, meaning slave, becomes servi, which means slaves. And with puer, which means boy, we also add that long I. So puer becomes pueri. Boy becomes boys. So let's look at an example sentence. Cornelia est puella Romana. This was one of the first sentences we saw in this book. And if we think back to last chapter, we can see we have a subject, a linking verb, and a complement. So remember, you always want to diagram sentences in Latin. It'll help you understand how to translate them. Now, if we want to make this plural, we need to break it apart and change the endings of the words. So let's start with Cornelia. And at the moment, we can tell it's singular because it's ending in just that one A. Now, if we wanted to have more than one Cornelia in the room, we could add an AE to the end of that to make it Cornelii. But for right now, since there isn't more than one Cornelia in the story, let's try to do something different by adding one more person. So let's add Flavia into the equation. Now we have Cornelia et Flavia. We've taken the singular subject, which was Cornelia, and we've made it plural by adding one more person. Next, we have to look at the verb, which is est. And you want to think, in English, you wouldn't say he want to study Latin. You would say he wants to study Latin. This is what we're after here, changing the verb around. And if you think to last chapter, you know that est is a singular and its plural form is sunt. So now we have Cornelia and Flavia are instead of Cornelia and Flavia is. The last part is looking at puella Romana, a Roman girl. So we can't say Cornelia and Flavia are Roman girl. We're trying to say Cornelia and Flavia are Roman girls. So we need to change this phrase from singular to plural. And since Romana is describing puella, we have to put them both into the plural. So specifically, we want to look at their endings. And again, they both have an A ending, which is the singular. So to make it plural, what are we going to do? We start with AE. We get Cornelia and Flavia, sunt puellae Romanae, Roman girls. This is the trick we're taking here. You have to change the noun and the adjective that goes with it into the plural. In this case, puella Romana ends in an A, so we have to switch it to an AE. We're going to go into this in a lot more depth later on, but for right now, this is a very good way to start paying attention to the endings of nouns and adjectives. So let's take a new sentence, davus est servus. Now, the noun we want to look at here is davus, which ends in a US, so it's different from our A ending. And off the bat, we know this is a singular sentence. And the reason we know is that you have to pick it apart and look at each individual word. So let's start with davus. This is the subject of our sentence. And if we look, we see that it ends in that US ending, which we know is a singular noun ending. Est is also a singular verb. It's one of our linking verbs that means he is. And remember, est is the singular we've learned, and sunt would be the plural. The last part is servus, which in this case is a complement. And again, it's ending in that US ending, so we know it's a singular complement, just like davus is. So let's start with davus. How do we change it from davus into a plural subject? Well, we can add another person. So let's make it davus et geta, davus and geta. Now we have two slaves, so it's going to be a plural subject. We need to make the rest of the sentence plural. So if we look at the verb est, we know we have to switch it again, and it's going to go from est to sunt. So now instead of saying davus and geta is, it says davus and geta are. Are is the word slave, servus. And again, remember the US ending is going to turn into a long I when it's plural. So what do? We drop the US and add that I, and it turns into davus et geta sunt servi. Davus and geta are slaves. The last category that we want to look at are the nouns and adjectives that end in R. This ending is tricky, and we're going to go into it in much more depth later on, but for right now, you want to think of it as being part of the same category as the nouns and adjectives that ended in US. This is a really simplified way of explaining it, but it'll help you for now. This category includes words such as puer and wir, boy and man. And just like the US category, working in a long I somehow. But instead of replacing the R with an I, we're going to be adding on this long I to the end of the word to make it plural. So for puer and wir, that's going to become pueri and viri, boys and men. So just a helpful hint, you want to remember that when you change the subject of a sentence from singular to plural, you also have to change the verb of the sentence from singular to plural. The reason for this is just like in English. You can't have a singular noun acting as the subject of a plural verb. So, for instance, if you had servus in agris laborat, a slave works in the fields. So the subject here is servus, slave. And we can tell, again, it's singular because of that US ending. The verb here is laborat, which ends in a T, which also makes it singular. So far, this works really well because we have a singular subject matching up with a singular verb. So what happens if we want to make this plural? Well, to do so, we have to change the subject, which is servus, and the verb that it goes with, laborat. We have to make both of them plural. So let's start with the subject. Servus ends in a US, so we know to make it plural, we're going to have to add the long I and make it servi. Now we have the slaves. To match our plural subject, now we have to have a plural verb, and we do this by changing the ending. So we turn laborat into laborant. Now with that nt plural ending, the sentence makes sense in Latin. It says, the slaves work in the fields. This example will help you moving forward in the book. Remember, you always want to change the subject to match the verb. If you have a plural subject, you need a plural verb. Singular subject needs a singular verb. This will help you out in the chapters coming up.